7 craziest war strategies ever used in the world. Picture this. You're a general facing impossible odds. Your enemy's walls are impenetrable. Their forces outnumber yours 10 to 1. What do you do when conventional warfare fails? Throughout history, desperate times have driven brilliant minds to devise strategies so outrageous, so seemingly insane, that they defied all military logic. These weren't just battles won by superior numbers or advanced weapons. These were victories achieved through pure audacity, cunning, and ideas so crazy that they actually worked. From wooden horses filled with soldiers to elephants crossing frozen mountains. From fire that burned on water to psychological warfare that broke entire armies without a single sword being drawn. Today, we're diving into 7 of the most unbelievable military strategies ever conceived by human minds. Strategies so wild that if you pitched them in a war room today, you'd probably be laughed out of the building. But here's the thing about history's greatest military minds. They understood that sometimes the most impossible plan is the only one that can succeed. Because when everyone expects you to do the logical thing, doing the illogical becomes your greatest weapon. These aren't just stories of ancient warfare. They're masterclasses in thinking outside the box, in turning weakness into strength, and in proving that sometimes the craziest idea in the room is exactly what you need. So buckle up, because we're about to explore how desperation, creativity, and sheer audacity changed the course of human history. Welcome to the most insane military strategies ever deployed on the battlefield. Let us begin with a story that started one of the most famous phrases in military history. Beware of Greeks bearing gifts. 1. Trojan horse. Our first strategy takes us back to around 1200 BCE to the windswept plains of ancient Anatolia, where one of history's most legendary deceptions was about to unfold. The Trojan War had been raging for 10 brutal years. The mighty Greek coalition, led by King Agamemnon, had laid siege to the impregnable city of Troy, but those towering walls remained unbreached. Thousands of Greek warriors had died on the beaches below, their blood soaking into the sand, yet Troy stood defiant. The Greeks were exhausted, their supplies dwindling, and morale was at an all-time low. That's when Odysseus, the cunning king of Ithaka, proposed an idea so audacious that it would either end the war or destroy what remained of the Greek army. "We're going to build a horse," he announced to the war council. Not just any horse, but a massive wooden structure, large enough to hide dozens of elite warriors inside its hollow belly. The plan was simple in concept, but terrifyingly complex in execution. The Greeks would pretend to abandon the siege, leaving behind only this mysterious wooden horse as an apparent offering to the gods. Meanwhile, their best fighters would be cramped inside the horse's belly, waiting in absolute silence for the perfect moment to strike. According to historical accounts from Virgil's Aeneid and other ancient sources, the horse stood nearly 30 feet tall, crafted from the timber of ships that had carried the Greek fleet across the Aegean Sea. The construction took weeks, with master craftsmen working day and night to create a structure that looked like a religious offering but functioned as a military weapon. The psychological warfare aspect was brilliant. The Trojans had spent a decade watching Greek ships on their horizon, and suddenly, one morning, the entire fleet was gone. Only this massive wooden horse remained, standing alone on the empty beach like a monument to Greek defeat. Inside Troy's walls, the debate raged for hours. Lokun, the Trojan priest, famously warned, "I fear the Greeks, even when bearing gifts." But his voice was drowned out by those who saw the horse as a sign of divine favor. The Trojans' fatal mistake was interpreting the horse through their religious worldview rather than their military experience. They saw what they wanted to see, proof that their gods had finally granted them victory. As night fell on what would be Troy's last day, the city erupted in celebration. Wine flowed freely through the streets, and the gates that had protected Troy for 10 years were thrown wide open to bring the horse inside. The Trojans had no idea they were wheeling their own destruction into the heart of their city. Hidden inside the horse's belly, elite Greek warriors, like Menelaus, Diomedes, and Neoptolemus, waited in cramped, suffocating darkness. They had been inside for nearly 24 hours, unable to move, speak, or even shift position without risking discovery. One cough, one sneeze, one moment of weakness, would have doomed them all. When the city finally fell into drunken sleep, the Greeks emerged like ghosts from their wooden tomb. They opened Troy's gates from the inside, and the main Greek army, which had been hiding behind a nearby island, poured into the defenseless city. By dawn, Troy was in flames, its 10-year resistance finally broken by 30 men and a wooden horse. What made this strategy so insane wasn't just the audacity of hiding soldiers inside a fake gift, it was the complete psychological reversal it required. The Greeks had to convince their enemies that they had given up, that they were admitting defeat, when in reality they were launching their most decisive attack. This wasn't just military strategy. It was theater, psychology, and engineering rolled into one desperate gamble. The Trojan horse became the template for every surprise attack, every deception, every moment when victory was snatched from the jaws of defeat through pure cunning rather than brute force. 2. Hannibal's elephant attack. Our second insane strategy takes us to 280 BC, where one man's impossible dream would become Rome's worst nightmare. Hannibal Barca, the brilliant Carthaginian general, was facing the most powerful military machine the ancient world had ever seen. Rome controlled the Mediterranean, their legions were considered invincible, and their navy dominated every sea route to Italy. Any sane military commander would have accepted that attacking Rome directly was suicide. But Hannibal wasn't just any commander, and sanity had nothing to do with his plan. While Roman generals expected him to attack by sea, Hannibal was secretly assembling the most bizarre invasion force in military history. His army included 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and here's where it gets crazy, 37 war elephants. Not just any elephants, but massive African elephants trained for battle. Each one a living, breathing, siege engine capable of trampling entire formations of enemy soldiers. The Romans had never seen anything like them. But Hannibal's destination made his choice of animals seem even more insane. He wasn't planning to march through the comfortable plains of Spain or sail across the Mediterranean like every other invader. He was going to cross the Alps in winter, with elephants. Let that sink in for a moment. Hannibal was planning to march African elephants, animals adapted to hot climates, across some of the most treacherous mountain terrain on Earth, in freezing temperatures that could kill a man in hours. His own officers thought he had lost his mind. The journey began in New Carthage, modern-day Spain, and the first part went smoothly enough. Hannibal's army swept through the Pyrenees, crushing local tribes and Roman allies who tried to stop them. But when they reached the foothills of the Alps, reality hit like an avalanche. The mountain passes were narrow, icy, and completely unsuitable for large animals. The elephants, weighing up to 6 tons each, struggled with every step. Their feet, designed for African savannas, couldn't grip the frozen rocks. Many slipped and fell to their deaths in the ravines below. The cold was merciless. Hannibal's soldiers, mostly from North Africa and Spain, had never experienced anything like alpine winter. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes, hypothermia killed men in their sleep, and the thin mountain air made every breath a struggle. But the elephants suffered most of all. These magnificent creatures, symbols of Carthaginian power, began dying one by one. Some froze to death during the night. Others collapsed from exhaustion and starvation. The local Celtic tribes, initially awed by the sight of elephants, quickly realized these invaders were vulnerable and began launching guerrilla attacks on the struggling column. Hannibal lost nearly half his army crossing the Alps. Of the 37 elephants that began the journey, historical records suggest only one survived to see Italy. By any rational measure, the Alpine crossing was a disaster. But here's why it was also brilliant. Nobody saw it coming. When Hannibal's battered but still formidable army emerged from the Alpine passes into the Po Valley, the Romans were completely unprepared. They had positioned their legions to defend against a naval invasion from the south. Their northern defenses were minimal, designed to handle barbarian raids, not a professional Carthaginian army. The psychological impact was devastating. Roman soldiers had heard stories about Hannibal's elephants, but seeing them in person was terrifying. These weren't just large animals. They were living weapons that could charge through infantry formations like they were made of paper. The sound of their trumpeting, the thunder of their footsteps, the sight of armored warriors riding on their backs. It was unlike anything Roman legions had ever faced. At the Battle of Trebia, just months after crossing the Alps, Hannibal used his surviving elephants to devastating effect. The Romans had never developed tactics to fight against elephant cavalry. Their horses panicked at the sight and smell of the massive beasts. Their infantry formations broke apart, and what should have been a Roman victory turned into a catastrophic defeat. Over the next 2 years, Hannibal would win battle after battle, bringing Rome to the brink of collapse. His strategy of crossing the Alps had transformed him from a distant threat into an existential danger to the Roman Republic. What made this strategy so insane wasn't just the logistical nightmare of moving elephants through mountains. It was the complete reversal of conventional military wisdom. Every general knew you attacked your enemy where they were weakest, but you did it in a way that made sense. Hannibal attacked where Rome was weakest, but he did it in a way that seemed impossible. He turned the Alps from an impregnable natural barrier into his secret weapon. The Romans had always counted on the mountains to protect their northern border. Hannibal made those same mountains the highway for their destruction. This wasn't just military genius, it was a masterclass in doing the impossible, because it was impossible. 3. Api Yunani. Strategi gila ketiga, kita membawa kita ke abad ke-7 M, ke perairan Mediterania yang dilanda badai, di mana Kekaisaran Bizantium akan melepaskan neraka itu sendiri kepada musuh-musuh mereka. Tahun itu adalah 678 M. Dan Konstantinopel. Benteng terakhir Kekaisaran Romawi sedang dikepung. Kekhalifahan Umayyah Arab telah menyapu Timur Tengah dan Afrika Utara seperti gelombang yang tak terhentikan. Menaklukkan segala sesuatu di jalan mereka. Armada besar mereka, berjumlah ratusan kapal, telah memblokade Golden Horn, memutus ibu kota Bizantium dari dunia luar. Kaisar Konstantin keempat menyaksikan dari tembok kotanya saat kapal-kapal perang Arab memenuhi cakrawala. Superioritas laut mereka sangat luar biasa. Taktik mereka terbukti dalam kemenangan tak terhitung di seluruh Mediterania dengan setiap ukuran perang konvensional. Konstantinopel seharusnya jatuh dalam beberapa minggu. Tapi orang-orang Bizantium memiliki senjata rahasia yang begitu menakutkan, begitu revolusioner, sehingga akan mengubah perang laut selamanya. Mereka menyebutnya api Yunani. Dan itu akan mengubah arus sejarah. Komposisi tepat api Yunani tetap menjadi salah satu misteri terbesar sejarah. Rahasia negara yang dijaga begitu ketat, sehingga formulanya mati bersama Kekaisaran Bizantium itu sendiri. Yang kita ketahui dari catatan sejarah adalah bahwa itu adalah senjata pembakar cair yang bisa terbakar di atas air, menempel pada kapal musuh seperti napal, dan tidak bisa dipadamkan dengan cara konvensional. Beberapa sejarawan percaya itu mengandung petroleum, belerang, dan kapur tohor, sementara yang lain menyarankan itu termasuk sendawa atau bahkan fosfor. Senjata itu digunakan melalui tabung perunggu yang disebut sifon. Pada dasarnya, penyembur api kuno yang dipasang di haluan kapal Bizantium. Tapi inilah yang membuat api Yunani benar-benar gila. Itu melanggar segala sesuatu yang dipahami orang tentang api dan air. Selama ribuan tahun, pelaut tahu bahwa air adalah musuh terbesar api. Jika kapal Anda terbakar, Anda melemparkan air ke atasnya, atau Anda melompat ke laut untuk melarikan diri dari api. Api Yunani membuat air menjadi tidak relevan. Ketika kapal-kapal Bizantium mendekati armada Arab, pada hari yang menentukan itu, di tahun 678, para komandan Arab tidak terlalu khawatir. Mereka telah menghadapi kapal api sebelumnya. Kapal kasar yang dimuat dengan bahan mudah terbakar dan dibakar untuk menabrak armada musuh. Ini bisa dihindari, atau api mereka bisa dipadamkan dengan air laut. Tapi, ketika semburan pertama api Yunani meletus dari sifon perunggu, para pelaut Arab menyaksikan sesuatu yang menentang hukum alam. Api cair menyembur, melintasi air dalam aliran oranye dan kuning, mendarat di kapal mereka, dan langsung meledak, menjadi api yang tidak bisa disentuh air. Api itu menempel pada kayu, tali, dan layar seperti makhluk hidup. Menyebar lebih cepat dari yang bisa direaksi manusia. Pelaut Arab yang melompat ke laut untuk melarikan diri dari api, mendapati bahwa api mengikuti mereka ke dalam air, terbakar di permukaan laut itu sendiri. Dampak psikologisnya menghancurkan. Ini bukan hanya kapal yang terbakar. Ini adalah perang supernatural. Api yang berperilaku seperti iblis yang dilepaskan dari neraka. Penulis sejarah Arab menggambarkan pemandangan itu sebagai apokaliptik. Dengan laut itu sendiri tampak terbakar saat api Yunani menyebar di permukaan air. Suaranya sama menakutkannya. Gemuruh api, teriakan orang-orang yang terbakar, dan desiran khas sifon yang meluncurkan aliran baru api cair. Dalam beberapa jam, armada Arab berada dalam kekacauan total. Kapal-kapal yang telah mendominasi Mediterania selama puluhan tahun direduksi menjadi api terapung. Awak mereka baik mati atau melarikan diri dalam panik. Pengepungan Konstantinopel dipatahkan dan kemajuan Arab ke Eropa dihentikan dingin. Tapi jenius sejati api Yunani bukan hanya kekuatan destruktifnya, itu adalah keuntungan strategis yang diberikannya. Orang-orang Bizantium telah menciptakan senjata yang mustahil untuk dilawan dengan teknologi yang ada. Anda tidak bisa berlindung darinya, Anda tidak bisa memadamkannya, dan Anda tidak bisa mereplikasinya tanpa formula rahasia. Selama lebih dari 400 tahun, api Yunani memberikan Angkatan Laut Bizantium keuntungan yang hampir supernatural dalam pertempuran laut. Armada Arab yang telah menaklukkan dari Spanyol hingga India mendapati diri mereka tak berdaya melawan senjata misterius ini. Rumor belaka bahwa armada Bizantium membawa api Yunani sudah cukup untuk membuat laksamana musuh mempertimbangkan kembali rencana pertempuran mereka. Nilai perang psikologis senjata itu sama pentingnya dengan kehancuran fisiknya. Pelaut musuh akan panik pada pandangan pertama. Sifon perunggu sering meninggalkan pos mereka sebelum api bahkan digunakan. Orang-orang Bizantium dengan hati-hati menjaga rahasia api Yunani, menjadikannya kejahatan negara yang dapat dihukum mati untuk mengungkapkan formula kepada orang asing. Senjata itu diproduksi di fasilitas rahasia, dan hanya segelintir orang yang tahu resep lengkapnya. Kerahasiaan ini begitu efektif, sehingga ketika Kekaisaran Bizantium akhirnya jatuh pada tahun 1453, rahasia api Yunani mati bersamanya. Upaya modern untuk menciptakan kembali senjata itu telah menghasilkan berbagai campuran pembakar. Tetapi, tidak ada yang sempurna mereplikasi sifat-sifat yang dijelaskan dalam catatan sejarah. Yang membuat strategi ini begitu gila adalah bahwa itu mewakili pergeseran paradigma lengkap dalam perang laut. Orang-orang Bizantium tidak hanya menciptakan senjata baru, mereka menciptakan kategori baru perang yang tidak bisa dipahami musuh mereka, apalagi dilawan. Mereka membalikan hubungan fundamental antara api dan air, menciptakan senjata yang tampaknya melanggar hukum dasar fisika. Api Yunani menyelamatkan Kekaisaran Bizantium dari kehancuran tertentu dan melestarikan Eropa Kristen dari penaklukan Arab selama berabad-abad. Itu adalah senjata rahasia yang begitu efektif sehingga keberadaannya sendiri mengubah keseimbangan kekuatan di dunia abad pertengahan. Ini bukan hanya inovasi militer, itu adalah perang teknologi yang berbatasan dengan supernatural. 4. Operation Fortitude. Our fourth insane strategy takes us to 1944, where the fate of World War II hung in the balance, and the Allies were about to pull off the greatest magic trick in military history. Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion of Normandy, was humanity's most ambitious military operation, but its success depended entirely on one thing: convincing Hitler that the real invasion was happening somewhere else. Enter Operation Fortitude, a deception so elaborate, so audacious, that it involved creating an entire phantom army complete with fake generals, rubber tanks, and Hollywood-level special effects. The stakes couldn't have been higher. If the Germans discovered the real invasion target, they could concentrate their forces at Normandy and turn the beaches into a slaughter. That would set back the Allied war effort by years. The Allies needed Hitler to believe the invasion would come at Potomac, the narrowest point of the English Channel, where German defenses were strongest. But how do you convince the most paranoid dictator in history that your fake army is real? The answer was to create the most elaborate military theater production ever conceived. The Allies invented the first United States Army Group, or a completely fictional military unit that existed only on paper and in German intelligence reports. To command this phantom army, they chose General George S. Patton, the most feared Allied general in German eyes. Patton, who the Germans respected and feared more than any other Allied commander, was publicly assigned to lead Fusag, lending credibility to the deception. But creating a fake army required more than just paperwork and press releases. The Allies had to make Fusag visible to German reconnaissance planes and spies. They constructed an entire fake military base in southeastern England, complete with inflatable tanks, plywood aircraft, and canvas buildings that looked real from the air. These weren't crude decoys. They were masterpieces of military theater, created by artists, set designers, and special effects experts recruited from Hollywood and British film studios. The inflatable tanks were so realistic that they fooled German aerial photography. Each rubber Sherman tank costs only a few $100s, but appeared identical to the real thing from reconnaissance altitude. The Allies deployed hundreds of these decoys, creating the illusion of massive armored divisions preparing for invasion. But the deception went far beyond fake equipment. The Allies created an entire fictional radio network, with operators sending thousands of fake messages between non-existent units. German radio intercept stations picked up this chatter and dutifully reported the movements and preparations of divisions that existed only in the imagination of Allied intelligence officers. They even created fake supply problems, with radio operators complaining about shortages of equipment and delays in training, making the deception more believable. The Allies recruited double agents to feed false information directly to German intelligence. Agent Garbo, a Spanish double agent working for the British, sent over 500 messages to his German handlers, describing in detail the preparations of the fictional Fusag. His reports were so convincing that the Germans awarded him the Iron Cross, never knowing he was working for the enemy. To make the deception even more convincing, the Allies staged elaborate fake exercises and maneuvers. They organized mock amphibious landings near Dover, complete with real ships and troops, ensuring German spies would witness what appeared to be invasion rehearsals for an assault on Potsdam. The psychological warfare component was equally sophisticated. Allied intelligence knew that Hitler's decision-making was influenced by his intuition and paranoia as much as by military intelligence. They crafted the deception to play into Hitler's preconceptions about where the Allies would strike. Pas-de-Calais was the logical choice. The shortest sea crossing, the most direct route to Germany, and the area where a successful landing could quickly threaten the German heartland. The Allies made their fake preparations so obvious that German intelligence would discover them and report back to Hitler, confirming his own strategic assumptions. On June 6, 1944, when the real invasion began at Normandy, the deception continued. Even as Allied forces stormed the beaches, German high command remained convinced that Normandy was a diversion and that the real invasion would still come at Potsdam. Hitler kept his strongest reserves, including elite panzer divisions, positioned to defend against the phantom Fusag army that would never come. 4 weeks after D-Day, German forces remained divided, waiting for an invasion that existed only in their minds. The success of Operation Fortitude was measured not just in lives saved, but in the complete paralysis of German strategic thinking. The Germans had fallen so completely for the deception that they could unadapt to reality even when it was happening right in front of them. What made this strategy so insane wasn't just the scale of the deception, but the psychological sophistication required to pull it off. The Allies had to think like their enemies, understand their fears and assumptions, and then craft a lie so perfect that it became more believable than the truth. They created an entire alternate reality, complete with fake armies, fake generals, and fake invasion plans, and convinced the German high command that this fiction was more real than the actual Allied forces preparing for the real invasion. Operation Fortitude proved that in modern warfare, the battle for the enemy's mind could be more important than the battle for territory. The Allies won D-Day before the first soldier set foot on Normandy Beach by winning the war of imagination and deception. 5. Kamikaze attack. Our fifth insane strategy takes us to the Pacific theater of World War II, where desperation drove an entire nation to weaponize the ultimate sacrifice: human life itself. By 1944, the Japanese Empire was facing inevitable defeat. American forces had island-hopped across the Pacific, crushing Japanese defenses and moving inexorably toward the Japanese mainland. The once mighty Imperial Navy lay in ruins at the bottom of the Pacific, and Japan's experienced pilots were either dead or too few to make a difference in conventional warfare. Emperor Hirohito and his military commanders faced an impossible choice: surrender unconditionally or find a way to make the cost of victory so high that America would negotiate a peace treaty. They chose a third option that shocked the world: the systematic use of suicide attacks as a primary military strategy. The kamikaze, meaning divine wind, was named after the typhoons that had saved Japan from Mongol invasion in the 13th century. But this divine wind would be made of flesh, blood, and aircraft loaded with explosives. The strategy was born from cold, brutal mathematics. Japanese military analysts calculated that conventional attacks had a success rate of less than 10% against heavily defended American ships. A trained pilot might survive multiple missions, but his chances of actually hitting and sinking an enemy vessel were minimal. Kamikaze attacks, however, had a success rate of nearly 20%, and every attack was guaranteed to cost the enemy at least one aircraft and one pilot. From a purely tactical standpoint, trading one Japanese pilot for one American ship was an acceptable exchange ratio, but the psychological impact was the real weapon. The first organized kamikaze attack came during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. Vice Admiral Tokijiro Onishi, facing overwhelming American naval superiority, made the decision that would define the final phase of the Pacific War. He gathered his remaining pilots and asked for volunteers for special attack missions. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Young pilots, some barely out of their teens, lined up to volunteer for missions they knew would be their last. These weren't desperate men driven to suicide by despair. They were trained military personnel making a calculated decision to trade their lives for maximum military impact. The kamikaze pilots underwent intensive training, but not in survival techniques or evasive maneuvers. They learned how to maximize damage, the best angle of approach, the most vulnerable parts of enemy ships, and how to ensure their aircraft would penetrate the target rather than simply exploding on impact. They practiced diving attacks until the maneuvers became instinctive, knowing that in actual combat, they would have only one chance to get it right. The aircraft themselves were modified for maximum destructive potential. Zeros, Vals, and other Japanese fighters were stripped of unnecessary equipment and loaded with explosives. Some carried bombs weighing over 500 pounds, turning the entire aircraft into a guided missile with a human brain. The pilots removed their parachutes, not just to save weight, but as a symbolic gesture that there would be no turning back. When the first kamikaze attack struck the American fleet off the Philippines, the psychological impact was immediate and devastating. American sailors had faced enemy fire before, but this was different. These weren't pilots trying to bomb their ships and escape. These were men deliberately flying their aircraft directly into American vessels, turning themselves into human weapons. The sight of a Japanese plane diving straight down, its pilot visible in the cockpit, knowing that nothing would deter him from his target, was psychologically traumatic for American crews. Traditional anti-aircraft tactics became less effective because kamikaze pilots didn't try to evade defensive fire. They flew straight through the flak, accepting hits that would normally force a pilot to break off his attack. Even when their aircraft were damaged and on fire, kamikaze pilots continued their dives, sometimes steering their burning planes into targets with their last conscious moments. The USS Bunker Hill was hit by 2 kamikaze attacks within minutes, killing 396 sailors and wounding 264 others. The USS Franklin was nearly sunk by a single kamikaze that penetrated the flight deck and exploded among armed aircraft, creating a chain reaction of explosions that turned the carrier into an inferno. These weren't just military casualties. They were psychological victories that made American commanders question whether the cost of invading Japan would be acceptable. The kamikaze strategy reached its peak during the Battle of Okinawa in 1945. Over 1,900 kamikaze attacks were launched during the 3-month battle, sinking 36 American ships and damaging 368 others. The attacks were so intense that American sailors developed kamikaze neuroses, a form of combat stress specifically related to the constant threat of suicide attacks. But the true genius of the kamikaze strategy wasn't just its tactical effectiveness. It was its strategic psychological warfare. Japanese military leaders understood that Americans valued individual life differently than Japanese culture did. Every kamikaze attack sent a message. Japanese resistance would continue until the last man, and the cost of conquering Japan would be measured in hundreds of thousands of American lives. The strategy worked exactly as intended. American military planners estimated that Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan, would result in over 1 million American casualties. The prospect of facing an entire nation willing to die rather than surrender influenced President Truman's decision to use atomic weapons. Instead of launching a ground invasion, what made this strategy so insane wasn't just the willingness to sacrifice human life, but the systematic way it was implemented. This wasn't desperate individuals making spontaneous decisions. It was a coordinated military strategy that turned suicide into a weapon of war. The Japanese military created training programs, developed specialized equipment, and established entire units dedicated to suicide attacks. They industrialized martyrdom, turning individual sacrifice into mass-produced warfare. The kamikaze strategy ultimately failed to save Japan from defeat, but it succeeded in its primary goal, making the cost of victory so high that America chose atomic weapons over invasion. In a twisted way, the kamikaze attacks may have saved more lives than they cost by convincing American leaders that a ground invasion of Japan would be too costly to contemplate. This was warfare reduced to its most fundamental equation: life versus life, with victory going to whoever was willing to pay the highest price. 6. Australian Emu Wars. Our sixth insane strategy takes us to 1932 Australia, where the government declared war on an enemy so unexpected, so seemingly harmless, that the conflict would become one of the most embarrassing military defeats in modern history. The enemy wasn't a foreign army, a terrorist organization, or even human beings. Australia declared war on emu. Yes, you heard that correctly. Large, flightless birds became the target of a military operation that would involve machine guns, soldiers, and official government resources. This wasn't a joke or a publicity stunt. This was a genuine military campaign with real strategic objectives, documented battle reports, and an outcome that would haunt the Australian military for decades. The Great Emu War, as historians would later call it, began with what seemed like a simple agricultural problem. After World War I, the Australian government had promised land grants to returning veterans in Western Australia. These ex-soldiers were encouraged to become wheat farmers, turning the vast expanses of the Australian outback into productive agricultural land. But by 1932, the Great Depression had devastated wheat prices, and these veteran farmers were struggling to survive. Then nature delivered the final blow. An invasion of approximately 20,000 emus migrating from inland areas toward the coast. These weren't ordinary farm pests. Emus are massive birds, standing up to 6 feet tall and weighing over 100 pounds each. They travel in large flocks, can run at speeds of up to 30 miles per hour, and have an appetite that can devastate crops in a matter of days. The emu migration coincided perfectly with the wheat harvest season, turning what should have been the farmers' salvation into their destruction. Entire wheat fields that represented months of back-breaking labor were trampled and consumed overnight. The farmers, many of them great war veterans who had survived the trenches of France, found themselves helpless against an enemy they couldn't shoot, couldn't outrun, and couldn't negotiate with. Desperate farmers petitioned the government for help, and their requests reached the desk of Sir George Pearce, the Minister of Defense. What happened next defied all logic and military protocol. Instead of treating this as an agricultural issue requiring pest control experts, the Australian government decided to deploy the military. On November 2nd, 1932, Major G.P.W. Meredith of the Royal Australian Artillery was given command of a military expedition equipped with 2 Lewis machine guns and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. His mission: eliminate the emu threat using military force. The operation began with the confidence typical of military campaigns against inferior enemies. How difficult could it be to defeat a bunch of birds with modern military weapons? The soldiers expected to complete their mission within days, returning home with stories of an easy victory against Australia's most unusual enemy. Reality proved far more challenging than anticipated. The first engagement occurred when Major Meredith's unit encountered a flock of approximately 50 emu. The soldiers set up their machine guns and opened fire, expecting to mow down the birds like infantry in no man's land. But emus, it turned out, were remarkably difficult targets. Unlike human soldiers who might panic under machine gun fire, the emus simply scattered in all directions, using their incredible speed and agility to evade the bullets. The birds seemed to understand that staying together made them vulnerable, so they split into smaller groups, making it nearly impossible for the machine gunners to achieve effective fire concentration. Even more frustrating, emus proved to be surprisingly resilient to gunfire. Their thick feathers and tough skin meant that shots that did hit vital organs often failed to bring them down immediately. Wounded emus would continue running, sometimes for miles, before finally collapsing. The soldiers found themselves chasing individual birds across the vast Australian landscape, burning through ammunition at an alarming rate while achieving minimal results. After the first week of operations, Major Meredith's unit had fired nearly 2,500 rounds and killed fewer than 50 emus. The kill ratio was so poor that military headquarters began questioning whether the operation was worth continuing. But the emus weren't just evading the soldiers, they seemed to be learning from each encounter. The birds began posting sentries, while the main flock fed, creating an early warning system that allowed them to escape before the soldiers could get within effective range. Some flocks developed the tactic of splitting into multiple groups when approached, forcing the soldiers to choose which group to pursue, while the others escaped. The emus had essentially developed guerrilla warfare tactics against a conventional military force. The situation became even more embarrassing when the media got involved. Newspapers across Australia began reporting on the emu war with a mixture of amusement and disbelief. Headlines like "Emus win again and birds defeat army" turned the military operation into a national joke. International media picked up the story. And suddenly Australia was explaining to the world why its army was losing a war against birds. The psychological impact on the soldiers was significant. These were professional military personnel, many of them veterans of World War I, being outmaneuvered by animals with brains the size of walnuts. The constant failure to achieve their objectives, combined with public ridicule, created a morale crisis that affected the entire operation. After 6 months of intermittent operations, the military officially withdrew from the field. The final tally was devastating. Approximately 986 rounds fired for every emu killed, with total emu casualties estimated at fewer than 200 birds. The remaining 19,800 emus continued their migration, largely unimpeded by Australia's military intervention. Major Meredith later commented that the emus had displayed a degree of tactics that would have done credit to any general, acknowledging that his human soldiers had been outfought by their avian opponents. What made this strategy so insane wasn't just the decision to use military force against wildlife, but the complete misunderstanding of the nature of the enemy. The Australian government approached the emu problem with conventional military thinking: deploy superior firepower against a concentrated enemy force and achieve decisive victory through overwhelming force. But emus weren't a conventional enemy. They were a distributed, mobile, adaptive force that could absorb casualties and continue operating effectively. The birds had no central command structure to decapitate, no supply lines to cut, and no morale to break. They were fighting for survival using instincts honed by millions of years of while the humans were constrained by military doctrine designed for fighting other humans. The Great Emu War became a masterclass in asymmetric warfare, proving that superior technology and training mean nothing if you're fighting the wrong kind of war. The emus won not through superior strategy or tactics, but by being fundamentally unsuited to the type of conflict their enemies were trying to impose on them. This wasn't just military failure, it was a complete breakdown of strategic thinking that turned Australia's army into an international laughingstock. 7. Psychological warfare of Genghis Khan. Our 7th and final insane strategy takes us to the 13th century, where one man would conquer more territory than any human being in history, using a weapon more powerful than any sword or siege engine. Pure psychological terror. Genghis Khan didn't just build the largest contiguous empire the world has ever seen. He weaponized fear itself, turning reputation into his most devastating military asset. By 1220, the Mongol Empire stretched from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean, encompassing over 12 million square miles of territory. But here is the truly insane part. Genghis Khan achieved most of these conquests without fighting a single battle. Cities surrendered at the mere mention of his name. Armies fled before his forces even appeared on the horizon, and entire kingdoms capitulated rather than face the psychological horror that preceded every Mongol invasion. This wasn't just military conquest. This was warfare elevated to the level of mass psychology, where the idea of Genghis Khan became more terrifying than his actual army. The strategy began with a simple but brilliant observation. Killing every enemy soldier was inefficient, but terrifying. Every potential enemy was devastatingly effective. Genghis Khan understood that news traveled faster than armies, and that a carefully crafted reputation could defeat enemies before the first arrow was fired. He systematically built a brand of terror so complete, so horrifying, that the mere possibility of Mongol invasion would paralyze entire civilizations. The psychological warfare campaign started with the complete destruction of selected targets. When the Mongols encountered resistance, they didn't just defeat their enemies, they erased them from existence in ways so brutal and complete that survivors would spread stories that grew more terrifying with each retelling. The siege of Urgench in 1221 became the template for Mongol psychological warfare. When the city refused to surrender, Genghis Khan didn't just capture it, he turned it into a lesson that would echo across continents. Every single inhabitant was killed, the city was razed to the ground, and the Mongols diverted a river to flow over the ruins, ensuring that no trace of Urgench would ever exist again. But the true genius was in the survivors they deliberately allowed to escape. These weren't accidental survivors, they were carefully selected witnesses whose job was to spread the story of what happened to cities that resisted the Mongols. These traumatized refugees would travel to other cities, carrying tales of horror so vivid and detailed that they became more effective than any military intelligence. The stories grew in the telling, as traumatized minds embellished already horrific realities. Accounts spread of Mongol warriors drinking the blood of their enemies, of pyramids built from human skulls, of entire populations being herded like cattle to their slaughter. Some stories were true, others were exaggerated, but all served the same purpose: creating a psychological weapon that could defeat armies without a single casualty. The Mongols perfected the art of selective brutality. They would completely destroy one city while sparing another that surrendered immediately, creating a clear message. Resistance meant annihilation, submission meant survival. This wasn't random violence. It was calculated psychological warfare designed to create a cost-benefit analysis that always favored surrender. The siege of Kiev in 1240 demonstrated the sophistication of this strategy. When Mongol envoys arrived demanding surrender, they brought with them detailed accounts of what had happened to other cities that had resisted. They described the fate of Baghdad, where the Mongols had killed over 200,000 people and destroyed the House of Wisdom, erasing centuries of human knowledge. They told of Samarkand, where the population had been systematically executed and the city left as a monument to the consequences of defiance. The psychological impact was so complete that Kiev's defenders abandoned the city before the siege even began. But Genghis Khan's psychological warfare went beyond simple terror. It included sophisticated intelligence operations that made resistance seem futile. Mongol spies would infiltrate target cities months before any military action, spreading rumors about the size and capabilities of the approaching army. These agents would exaggerate Mongol numbers, describe supernatural abilities of Mongol warriors, and create an atmosphere of hopelessness that undermined any will to resist. The Mongols also employed what modern psychologists would recognize as learned helplessness. They would surround a city but delay their attack for weeks or months, allowing fear and desperation to build within the walls. Defenders would watch the Mongol camp grow larger each day, knowing that their fate was sealed but unable to do anything about it. This psychological torture was often more effective than any siege engine in breaking the will to fight. The strategy included sophisticated propaganda operations designed to turn enemies against each other. Mongol agents would spread rumors about planned betrayals, question the loyalty of military commanders, and create suspicion between different ethnic or religious groups within target cities. By the time the Mongols actually attacked, their enemies were often already fighting among themselves. The most insane aspect of this strategy was its self-perpetuating nature. Each successful psychological victory made the next one easier, as the Mongol reputation grew to mythical proportions. Cities began surrendering to Mongol armies that didn't even exist, as local commanders received reports of approaching forces that were actually hundreds of miles away. The fear of Genghis Khan had become so powerful that it operated independently of his actual military presence. Persian chroniclers wrote of entire regions evacuating at rumors of Mongol approach, creating refugee crises that destabilized neighboring territories before any Mongol soldier had crossed the border. The psychological weapon had become so effective that it was causing strategic damage without any military investment whatsoever. The Battle of Mohi in 1241 showcased the ultimate evolution of this strategy. When the Mongols faced a Hungarian army that significantly outnumbered them, they didn't rely on superior tactics or equipment. Instead, they used their reputation as a weapon, spreading stories among Hungarian troops about the supernatural abilities of Mongol warriors and the futility of resistance. Hungarian soldiers began deserting before the battle even began, convinced that they were facing demons rather than men. What made this strategy so insane wasn't just its effectiveness, but its complete inversion of traditional military thinking. Most generals sought to win battles through superior force, better tactics, or advanced technology. Genghis Khan won wars by making battles unnecessary, turning the enemy's imagination into his most powerful ally. He understood that the human mind was the ultimate battlefield, and that conquering fear was more important than conquering territory. The Mongol Empire's rapid expansion wasn't just the result of military superiority. It was the product of the most sophisticated psychological warfare campaign in human history. Genghis Khan had weaponized reputation itself, creating a terror so complete that it could defeat enemies who had never seen a Mongol warrior. This wasn't just conquest. It was the systematic destruction of the will to resist, achieved through the careful cultivation of a legend that became more powerful than any army. The strategy proved that in warfare, perception could be more important than reality, and that the most devastating weapon wasn't made of steel, but of stories that lived in the minds of your enemies. Closing. And there you have it. 7 of the most insane military strategies ever conceived by human minds. Each one proving that sometimes the craziest idea in the room is exactly what changes the course of history. From the wooden horse that ended a tenure siege to the psychological warfare that conquered continents without firing a shot. These strategies share one common thread. They succeeded precisely because they were impossible. The Trojan horse worked because no one expected an army to hide inside a gift. Hannibal's elephants crossed the Alps because Romans never imagined anyone would be crazy enough to try. Greek fire dominated the seas because it violated everything people understood about fire and water. Operation Fortitude fooled Hitler because the deception was so elaborate that fiction became more believable than reality. Kamikaze attacks terrorized American fleets because they turned the fundamental human instinct for survival on its head. The Great Emu War failed spectacularly because conventional military thinking couldn't adapt to an unconventional enemy, and Genghis Khan conquered the world because he understood that the battlefield of the mind was more important than any physical terrain. These weren't just military victories, they were triumphs of human creativity over conventional wisdom. They remind us that, throughout history, the greatest breakthroughs have come from people willing to think beyond the boundaries of what everyone else considered possible. In warfare, as in life, the most dangerous opponent isn't the one with the biggest army or the most advanced weapons. It's the one who refuses to play by the rules everyone else takes for granted. These strategies teach us that innovation often looks like insanity until it succeeds. They show us that the difference between genius and madness is often nothing more than results. Most importantly, they prove that human ingenuity, when pushed to its limits by desperation or necessity, can achieve things that seem to defy the laws of physics, logic, and common sense. The next time you face an impossible problem, remember these 7 strategies. Remember that sometimes the solution isn't to work harder within existing constraints, but to completely reimagine what's possible. Remember that the most effective weapon isn't always the most obvious one, and remember that throughout history, the people who changed the world were the ones crazy enough to believe they could do the impossible, because sometimes the impossible is just another word for no one has tried it yet. Thank you for joining me on this journey through history's most insane military strategies. If you enjoyed learning about these incredible stories of human ingenuity and audacity, make sure to subscribe for more content that explores the fascinating intersection of history, psychology, and human creativity. Until next time, keep thinking outside the box, because you never know when the craziest idea might just be the one that changes everything.